Hi, everyone. Welcome to the CANARIE and CRKN and ORCID Consortia webinar series. Today we're going to be talking about enabling access to ORCID using Federated Identity. My name is Chris Phillips. I'm the Technical Architect for the Canadian Access Federation. And with me I have...
Hi, everyone. It's Gloria Booth-Morrison, Orchid CA Member Support Specialist.
Thanks, Gloria. We have a couple other people in the room who are helping us support this, and we really appreciate their participation. And what I'm going to ask first is just a quick audio check and visual check. If you can just give us a couple comments in the window, can you hear us okay? And whether or not you see the screen. We just want to make sure everyone has a great experience. Awesome. So Eric is another person in the room here. Eric, how many people do we have on the call today?
48 right now.
We have about 48 people on the call today, and we really appreciate you taking your hour out of your day today, and hopefully we can add some value to your day. Everyone's chiming in that everything's okay. And just so you know, for us as speakers, we don't have visibility to the Zoom chat window here, and we're going to hold questions at the end of the session. There was a question just now about, is this going to be recorded? So yes, we're going to record the session today. And we value your privacy and confidentiality as we do this. And if you have a challenge with being recorded or having your conversation observed in post-production here, we can't suppress it during the call. So you can choose to drop from the call right now, but your name or organization will be recorded, presence will be recorded in any comments or conversation pieces. So we haven't had problems in the past, and we just want to make sure we're very upfront with this. Anyways, I'll hand it off to Gloria.
Aussi, juste avant de commencer, j'aimerais souligner que si vous avez jamais des questions en français, je peux les répondre par après ou sinon par courriel, mais la présentation aujourd'hui va être en anglais, par exemple. Okay, to get started, just as a brief introduction, what is ORCID? I'm assuming there's a fair amount of understanding as it is, but just to go over it, ORCID is an open nonprofit organization run by and for the research community. And what is provided is a unique identifier that clearly connects a researcher to their work, to their education, to their employment, to the credentials, and particularly today we're going to concentrate on how it can be linked up to an institution through the ORCID memberships. So a little bit more about ORCID. It's free for users, and that's always really important to reiterate. And there's several tiers of membership. So there's the free membership and the fee-based API. So the fee-based API, specifically the premium member API, is what we at Orchid CA and at CRKN encourage people to use because it really enables a deeper integration to ORCID APIs, and it's excellent for institutions and for projects or publishers. It's the one we strongly suggest users use. And the API is used chiefly for the synchronization between research outputs, researchers, and publications. So on the right there, you see what might be very familiar to some of you, the orchid.org front page, where you can get a quick 1, 2, 3 about setting up an ORCID ID, how quick it is, what kind of information would be included in your record. So this is the once over kind of the interoperability, and at the center you would have the researcher, and you can see, if I can find my mouse, here this is the unique identifier that we're talking about. So each person would be assigned a code, and then they can interact with broadly the funder, their employer, and the publisher. So essentially with an employer, it's the connect and collect feature of ORCID where you would assert the affiliation. So if you were a researcher, for example, at Concordia, you would assert your relationship to Concordia. Concordia would be able to engage with your record and push and pull information in between those. If you were working towards a SSHRC or an NSERC grant, that's in the funder on the bottom, you would be able to assert the awards back and forth such that you can see for the funder that would be useful as a return on investment or ROI, and for you as a researcher it would be valuable to be able to present to others what grants you've been awarded for your work. And probably most interestingly to our audience today, you also have affiliations with the publisher. And what happens there is that it avoids some of the administrative labor and rework of needing to list once again in another place all your publications, because if you have these relationships with the publishers, and specifically with Crossref, you can assert that affiliation and use the DOIs to populate your ORCID record with any articles that you have published thus far, and that once that relationship is in place, it'll auto-populate your research profile. And you can see how that would be valuable again for employers and for future grant applications where they often request you to again list that list of publications. Okay, so just a little bit of repping here for the ORCID CA Consortium. So the ORCID CA Consortium is the body that is working together to promote and encourage and support membership in ORCID, specifically in Canada. So ORCID, as a nonprofit, has set up a consortial agreement with many different countries, from Australia to Norway, US, all over the place. And the one in Canada, we've been around since 2016, 2017, is the ORCID CA, and you can see there our website, orchidca.org. And the Canadian consortium is led by Canada's major licensing body, this CRKN, affectionately known as the Canadian Research and Knowledge Network, and that provides institutions and organizations with membership to ORCID at a reduced cost. So there is a license fee associated with having access to the premium member API, but when you are going through it via a consortium, that fee is substantially reduced, as well as having access to community support services and some of that shared learning across institutions. So, many of you may have just received my email about the second year of our license. And the good news for that is that any organizations or institutions that would like to join for the second year of the agreement, which runs May of this year through to April of next year, is that the support fee, which is a portion of the license cost, has actually gone down. So that may become more affordable to some smaller institutions. We currently have 31 members. 28 of those are universities. You can see in that gray box on the right who our institutions are, and we also have 3 research institutions, including NRC and 2 hospital centers. So as ORCID CA, there's obviously me, who's the member support specialist, and you have my contact information there at the bottom. But we are also directed by both an advisory and a governing committee. Some of you are present. I see you in the attendance list. So the advisory committee really acts as a means of directing strategically ORCID and how we see it going forward in the research landscape in Canada. And the governing committee is composed of ORCID CA members, and that really is the day-to-day operations and how we can direct the future of ORCID CA and how we hope to work with ORCID and how we hope to work with the ORCID CA members. So if anyone has any questions about that, you can always email me afterwards.
We're going to have questions at the end, right, Gloria?
Yeah, lots of people email me already, so more emails is good.
Great. Thanks very much. So we're getting on to the next section of our conversation on the webinar today is about using Federated Identity Management Service for single sign-on. And this is about taking bonding together some of the great things about what ORCID is and about leveraging the Federated Identity Management Service that CANARIE operates, called Canadian Access Federation. What we do when we get into the conversations with any institution or anyone in a broad conversation like this is we want to start people from the beginning. Institutions, when they manage an IT portfolio, they start assembling applications, and this is the stepping staircase of progress or a maturity model on the adoption of identity techniques. Many institutions started in this space quite a few years ago, where I have many applications. They didn't pair together. They use different IDs, yet it's the same people but different systems. A number are still in this space here where a single sign-on on campus works. And what that means is that there's one identity record in a central repository or system of record, but now there's a consistent technology layer across the top of the applications. This means that you can use the same user ID and password to sign into the system, but only within the domain that you're in. And what we're talking about today is how can you get access to ORCID using your identity provider, your single sign-on credentials, but in a federated context. So how does your organization tap into these services outside your campus safely, securely, as if you were on campus? And what we also do is we go through a quick rundown of the user single sign-on experience. And you may not realize it, but you probably use this experience already throughout your day. So usually what happens is users want to have access to services. This is what we call we're going to introduce some terminology here. So we call these service providers or relying parties. And they want to use this service. And that service then says, hey, you need to tell me or the institution that you're with. So there's this discovery service exercise. So saying, yep, this is me, this is my home institution. And what happens next is the identity provider at that institution, that server that operates the sign-on service, that single sign-on service, the service sends the person over to the institution. And that is part of the first few steps of the trust model, where CANARIE, Canadian Access Federation, has a set of trusts where we publish a trusted entity list. And this is the foundation of the trust model, is that if you're in that trusted list, whether you're domestic in Canada or through our interfederation or one of those trusted services abroad, this validation happens. Your identity provider at your home institution says, yep, the service is in there, we'll validate your user ID and password, and then allow you to sign on. This is a really important aspect because in this day and age, there's a lot of attacks to trying to phish your credential or trying to capture your user ID and password, as well as institutions also, when they integrate with services, they want to know that only the information that's being sent to them are sent there. As we saw in our staircase model, some in the old style was the user ID and password stayed in the application. But in this model, the user ID and password stays with the institution who is the one that should have it, and they do the validation. So once the validation happens, the user heads over to the service and that the sign-in was okay. The password's not revealed, just that there's an assertion. And what also happens is a set of attributes come with that assertion over the wire with the user to the service. And that's what we're talking about today. Your applications on campus, within your ERP, doing single sign-on, a variety of other ones like your learning management system. If you have a consistent user ID and password rendering page from one service, as opposed to one password page for every service, those are the differences to take a look at for. We're going to show that in a few moments. But this is the standard fare about single sign-on. And the takeaway for those who may not be very technical or not responsible for this space is we just wanted to familiarize you with terminology about what a service provider is, what an identity provider is, and what this discovery experience is, and you'll see in a few moments. The other thing that happens is once that user arrives to the service, this is how we'll explore in a few moments how ORCID says, yes, this institution, I trust you, and that when someone says, yep, someone signed on, and the attributes are provided to uniquely identify you, that's how ORCID trusts and knows your home institution is who they say they are. We're going to keep it high level at this stage of the game because what we're trying to do in the conversation today is socialize the notion of federated identity management connecting with ORCID as a way to sign on. We know that many of the people in the audience today are not necessarily the people who operate the stuff, but you are the users. And what we're hoping to enable you with are some of the key value propositions that you can take to your central IT team. And when you talk to them, you can really bring up some of these points. This presentation is going to be published, I believe, after the call. And so there'll be a link sent out with that online. So if you want your central IT folks to take a look at this and other presentations around federated identity management, those will be in our archive as well. But as the user, you get to have fewer passwords to remember. You have central location for your credential to be managed. And the institution procedures and controls can happen over the account. And it reduces costs across the board. Much like ORCID is advocating the use of ORCID to reduce costs on duplication and reduction of information, this is the same story here. For people who operate the service, this is how ORCID scales up at a global scale. So they don't manage the user ID and password database for your home credential, the institution does. They don't have to deal with your institutional password reset. And their actual cost of managing users, even though that you have a credential, a local password for user ID and password at ORCID, they much prefer you to sign in with your federated credential because that's a more secure and sound environment. And what we're talking about when we're talking about federated access for ORCID is equally valid for any other service. So if you are looking at a project in front of you, like your learning management system or your research output management system, this is something to think about and talk to your central IT department as well. Again, keeping at the very top level of things, we're trying to give you and the call some information about how services get your data. And again, we'll be using the word focus on ORCID as the primary. We'll show a couple other ways as well, a couple other services, sorry. But what works for ORCID is going to be working for others across the board. And that's a really powerful statement because that which works for ORCID is going to work for other services is a great enabler. It's going to get a little technical, not a lot, so you don't have to brace yourself too hard. But what happens in that trust model is Canadian Access Federation, CANARIE, publishes this file of trusted entities. It's called the metadata aggregate. So these are the identity providers and the service providers in our trust model that are allowed to trust each other in these assertions. And what happens is the classic way of doing something is have one identity provider create these trusts one at a time. While this worked really well in the early days, 10, 15 years ago, this was really novel and like really time-saving. This is really standard fare now. And this also has some, even though it's really great and has high fidelity, it has high cost to manage at scale. When we talk at scale, we're talking at the notion of hundreds of services. And how do we allow researchers get access to those without burdening the central IT department, saying, I need access to this service provider, can you release it please? What we're going towards, and we're advocating for sites to do, is adopt the notion of the categorization of services. Again, for those who are just working on a single project with ORCID or working on their own local research project, this is to speak up and say, if you're going to have a project that wants to have other institutions sign in, you have an opportunity to be a service, just like ORCID is. But when ORCID is looking to engage the community, this is the technique that they're using. They're adopting a model where the use of entity categories are being created. And what this is just a convenient way to group things together. So in the previous diagram, you saw the arrows going one at a time. What happens is the identity provider here says, if I see a service that is in this category called research and scholarship, we're going to release a unique identifier, an email address, a common name, and an affiliation. We know we're probably going to have questions about this at the end of the call, but we'll please hold them, and we'll be glad to answer them about the attribute conversation. But what this does is, in the global context, all these services that are tagged RNS, it's not just about Canadian services, it's about the research landscape at a global level. The ORCID record in the metadata aggregate actually comes from one of our peers in SurfNet in the Netherlands, because that's the federation that they joined. And when they joined, their record, their service provider record for ORCID was decorated with says, I'm a research and scholarship service. So as you can see here over the past few years, what is the growth of this? What is the adoption rate? Well, globally, the adoption rate is approaching a really good curve. Here in Canada, we're at the early stages because we've just rolled it out about a year or so ago. And rolling out services in Canada, we are encouraging sites to be their identity providers of your organizations on this call. I took a look, much like Gloria did, who attended the call, and we see a lot of familiar domains and faces. And I think some of you already support the research and scholarship category. And this is what we see for a platform for accessing services in Canada. This is a little bit more detail. So this notion of unique identifier, again, you remember at the beginning of the call, we talked about privacy and confidentiality. One of the things about when we're recording the call, this is another one of those things that we keep trust by privacy by design is built into our mantra with handling services. And by having the ante into the game of services using the RNS entity category, they have to attest that this is how they're using the information. And we know that when you go to your central IT department and say, I want to connect this service up and I want you to adopt this entity category model, we want to give you the confidence that this is a tried and true way and that it's privacy preserving and respects the way that institutions handle their information already. Speaking of that, some institutions have a model in some of their identity providers which use consent. What we see here is a screen of user consent once you sign in, and not all institutions do this yet, but it is available. Excuse me. So it is available, and what we find that institutions do behave is that for faculty, staff, and employees, your names are already on the website, they're in the white pages and the directories, and all we're saying to the institutions is, you're okay to put that information in directories on public pages. Let's be okay in doing it in the identity provider. But we also recognize that student records and grad student records, those things that which the organization is to curate, need additional forms of consent. So the technology is available and it is there to be used. And as you talk to your central IT organizations, just let them know that, yeah, this is available. And if anyone has any questions and they're part of the Access Federation or wanting to be, we can also help get there. Before I get off the RNS side of things, one of the things as we're going to get to a demo shortly, so I'm going to break out of the slide deck in a few moments. But before I do that, we want to give some guidance around what is the workflow at an institution. How do you thread the needle if you're in the library department or if you're in another department, research, but you're not the operator of the core services of your institution? What's the process? So the step one of review and approve the attribute release policy or the practices is something that central IT is familiar with. The submission of the CAF RNS application is also something that we'll just show a screenshot, but is available here. So your central IT shop is really your actor in this case and your advocate to being able to get this done for you. That central IT shop is also going to we're going to recommend that they have an opinion on privacy. Many institutions already have this opinion. So you have a privacy policy at your organization. My past experience before being here at CANARIE with Queen's University for just under a decade, and many of these things are already standard fare in an institutional setting. So the notion of RNS attribute release, we feel dovetails with the kind of model that is there. It should have little to no impact on your privacy policy, no edits there. So it's a light touch in that regard. So if you're new to the Canadian Access Federation, as you come on board, we suggest that this is something to consider in your initial project plan of onboarding. That would be your central IT department. If in many of the domains I saw on the call are existing CAF members, I'm not sure if they already are signing on, but if you are, great. Thank you very much. You're doing a great service to your users. And if you're already in the Canadian Access Federation, but you don't support the RNS attribute model that we just talked about, we encourage you to apply for the RNS. It could be as short as 2 weeks to add that in and put the policy in place, and attributes should start flowing. This is just the sign-up page here on the Research and Scholarship Entity category. This is where to find it on our website under the Identity tab. And yeah, your central IT folks will be there. And with that, I'm going to jump into, just do a quick time check, 1:25. I'm actually going to pause here, see if we'll open up to there's the ways to ask some questions. We'll give it pause for a few moments here just while we catch up on some questions here. So I'm looking at one from, we're just going to use first names initially. So Tristan, is there a catch-all solution service for Canadian researchers affiliated to an institution which is not an Orchid CA? That's an interesting question. So I think, Tristan, every researcher can sign into Orchid on their own, is the first statement I would make there. So that from a user access standpoint, there's that. And there is the public free APIs for access, for institutional access to do those updates for their members of their institution. But for the institutions, the most economical way, in my opinion, is to join Orchid CA. Gloria, thoughts?
Yeah, I would agree. I don't know, maybe if Tristan, you can email me afterwards. I'm not certain what you mean by a catch-all solution, a solution to exactly which issue, but I would say definitely it takes 30 seconds for any researcher to sign up for an ORCID ID, independent of any institution. So anyone who would like an ORCID ID anywhere can apply for one. If you're trying to determine things like querying the ORCID database in the absence of a premium membership, there is a sandbox that you could request credentials from, and that would allow you to interact with the public API, which is pretty good still, and it would give you a good understanding of how many researchers there were in an institution associated with ORCID. But like Chris said, the premium member API tends to be the most comprehensive and useful. If that was your question. If that was not your question, please let me know and email me after.
I see another question from Tristan about an ORCID-based federated identity management restricted to web platforms, or can we use it to authenticate users, say, to an SFTP server? So the short answer is it's not. The ORCID authentication techniques for the federated, you'll see in just a moment, is really aimed at the web platforms. But if you provide some contact information, we can dig a little deeper on the non-web solutions there for federated sign-on. There are other techniques and ways to use the same institutional credential to access that SFTP endpoint, but it's definitely a deeper conversation. So another one here, will this be consistent with GDPR? Because we work with a lot of European entities and scholars. Oh, that's a really good one. Gloria is really eager to answer that.
Yeah, so if I'm gonna make an assumption here and assume that the GDRP is referring to the German data research privacy document.
No, yeah. So I think really what's going on. So there's if it's a German one, okay, but there's the European data protection setting policy that are going into effect May 25th. So basically, Germany is an excellent example. So Germany leads the world in terms of most stringent regulations surrounding privacy and access to researchers' privacy. General data.
So recently, this was a report was really a two-year report was put up by the German government about access to research and privacy and data, and they found ORCID to be compliant with every single one of the really stringent regulations associated with it. So I would say, and that ORCID would have no issues working in a European context, and in fact, Europe is significantly ahead of us in terms of ORCID IDs associated to researchers, and even several European countries have mandated ORCID ID adoption. So I would say that it would be consistent.
Yeah. And for the general data protection regulation, what we're talking about in the context of using ORCID with federated identity management, accessing it that way, are Canadians accessing a resource that is in North America. And so the GDPR doesn't really come into play for this activity, but if your organization deals with European entities and scholars and such, that's within your wheelhouse on your side of things, as opposed to what we're hearing today. The question was submitted anonymously, so if you do have deeper questions, please let us know offline and we can cover them there. Kevin, you had a question about my institution uses Oracle Waveset and AD. Is there a specific documentation provided by CANARIE ORCID that I can point them to? Yes, we have some on the CANARIE website. It's under our documentation and setup documentation there. If depending on the name of your organization, you may already have an identity provider. So if you want more information, tickets@canarie.ca is an email address that you can reach out and contact. Can't speak. I don't think anything on the general Europe-wide May 2nd deadline. Don't know anything about that. And I think we're going to move on here. And we get an opportunity to break out of the slide deck. So what we're going to do is, I'm just going to do what we saw in the existing sign-on, which is sign into ORCID. I'm going to use my ORCID ID. I've already created one. I use federated sign-on to get to my ORCID. And this is the discovery interface. So this is the dance, the arrow diagram that you saw that we're weaving our way through. So once I choose this institutional account access, I'm going to choose the institution that which I've been using to sign into my ORCID. I should be asked my identity provider. This is just to point out a couple of things. One is that the domain is idp.canarie.ca, which is our identity provider. It's no one else's. And once I sign in, I'm now doing the federated sign-on, and now I have access to my environment. And what this does is it shows you that the institutional ID or sign-on I have can access this service. And one of the examples that you saw me open up in the background here is we have a number of other services that if you're part of the Canadian Access Federation that you also get access to. I'm just going to check the URL just a little bit. And what happens is, even though this looks a little code-like, what we're doing is we're just showing, and I'm feeling okay to put my information out front here, is that this is what happens behind the scenes about that transaction that happened on the last leg between our identity provider to ORCID, the service provider. It knows which address I'm coming from, the organization affiliation I have, and the information that's presented on the doorstep of the service. And as an identity provider, you have the flexibility of accessing different services in the RNS category. I've chosen a couple that are in the federation, and these are in the interfederation aggregate. And I'm going to choose this. This is Science Gaia. That's in Europe. I believe it's hosted by Italy. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose EduGain here. This is this worldwide sign-in. And what happens is you see yet another experience on the federated sign-on. This is this discovery page. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to type in CANARIE. I'm going to choose search. And I find my institution. If I wanted to access different institutions or have my origination come from different organizations, I can do that. And we'll get to a couple of the details in a moment about that. So I'm still signed in. I get my first fail. Awesome. And that may not have been my best place, but this site is obviously giving me some issues. So once again, I'm going to try another different site, and we'll try the EduGain one again here. This would be, or actually, I'm going to try the research software portal. This is the research software portal here at CANARIE, and this one is a service that CANARIE operates, and it's part of the Canadian Access Federation for researchers. So if you have software that you want to repurpose or want to leverage existing pieces of software, this is a portal in which you can search. And I also have, this is also part of the Federation, and I'm going to choose, this is the discovery experience again, and I'm going to choose CANARIE, which is nearby, as in the office, and now I'm signed in. So I have a valid user here, and I'm going to be married to the information in my service. So I'm going to flip back. This is just an example of some of the federated sign-on experience that we have linking to ORCID. I'm going to reduce the size a little bit. And that wheel diagram that we saw a few moments ago, this is my biography, my history. I'm not a person that seeks funding, so I don't have any funding records. And these records are works that I've created and put in there myself. These are the presentations or the papers that I've published. And you as a user can manage the privacy on each and every one of those elements. And if we think about the wheel diagram, is that keeping this CV current of my research opportunities and those kinds of things. That's incredibly burdensome in our community right now. And this gives an opportunity to simplify that by institutions being part of the consortia, being able to access the paid API in the most economical way possible, and institutions pushing your researcher material here and letting researchers focus on the research as opposed to keeping their CV current. That's a really big value proposition. So when we get into the conversation about just how many people are already connected, what we did is we took a look at the organizations on that ORCID CA side, the gray box there, 31 organizations. We know that 9 of those 31 are already using Canadian Access Federation to sign in, and they're already releasing attributes. We also know that 3 of those organizations are already doing that by research and scholarship entity categories. We know that those research and scholarship ones that are supporting that allow the ORCID, their users at their institution to sign into ORCID without any extra settings other than setting up RNS support. The other 6 in this side had to do that onesie-twosie kind of model and set up, I'm going to release attributes directly to ORCID, even though I'm in CAF. So this is just focused on the subset of members in the consortia. So many of you are in the consortia or probably on the call. So hooray, thumbs up for the 9 of your institutions that are doing this. You're doing a great service to your researchers, and we hope to engage essentially the rest of you on the call. When we look at this, if we zoom out a little bit just to say, okay, in the Canadian Access Federation, Federated Identity Management Service, how many support ORCID right now? How many sign-ons have there been? So of all the identity providers in Canada, 21 of them are using ORCID right now. So the previous numbers were just in the consortia alone, but there are other institutions that are not in the consortia that are signing in. So Gloria is just eagerly awaiting at the phone right now your call. So we also have the 33 other identity providers in the Canadian Access Federation who have the opportunity to configure ORCID support, research and scholarship, entity category support. We know the uptake, these are early days for institutions, and having done my decade at a university, we know things take time. But we also know that making things simpler for researchers is going to be really helpful. So the uptake has been really great, and we hope to see more of you. And this is what the call is for, is to provide that education about what does it mean to get into the federated identity space. We mentioned EduGain a few moments ago, or you saw me click around on EduGain, and that is our interfederation location. And think of that as the, if you collected, I was going to say in your library, which many of you operate. So in your library, you probably have copies of your local phone books as well as phone books across Canada or something, or in public libraries probably have those. So this is kind of like taking those trust records and putting them all together in one spot, one nexus, and allow that information to go through. So this is a glimpse of what we do at the Canadian Access Federation, and this is some of the instrumentation that we see about what's going on. There's 51 other federations around the world with over 2,600 identity providers and 1,900 services. And this is literally how the cross connects work. What we also do is, knowing that you on the call may not operate things, the question you may be scratching your head is like, am I connected? Am I already here? So there's some tools that are already out there. As part of EduGain, have the ability to use the Is Federated Check. The URL is here at technical.edugain.org/isfederated. We'll provide the slide deck at the end of the presentation, and once we've rendered the recording. But here, what will be able to happen is do a live check on your presence and whether or not you have an identity provider, and then whether or not it's configured accurately. This is important for us because it's one thing to have something up and going and running. It's another thing to have it configured accurately. And that's a really important point for us. And how we do that is we take a look at this. I'm going to jump out again and just cut and paste this guy here. This is the entity view that is a little bit different than what we had before. So I'm going to look for our IDP, idp.canarie.ca. And at the bottom here, this is our record. And the check that you're seeing, are we green, is present here. So what happens is EduGain is that central location where it manages our exchange of our metadata and where your identity providers show up. And by the way, if you're not green in here, your ORCID sign-on using Federated Identity Management is not going to be working, because the ORCID record is actually in SurfNet, the other federation in the Netherlands, and this is how we get our information. And that's how ORCID is able to trust you. So if it's not green, we don't call out those that are not green, because we know there's different uptakes and such. But this is a great self-test tool to make sure that you're there and ready. And as you can see, that there's some checks that you can perform the test yourself real time, and that there are tests in a temporal matter, whether it was today or yesterday. Because we know if someone says, oh my goodness, it's having a problem, and then the problem is resolved, it could have been a problem from yesterday. But these are some great tools for some diagnosis for your technical people. So you may already, this is kind of hammering it home, you may already be connected with the Canadian Access Federation Federated Identity Management Service. If you are, go ahead, sign into ORCID and link your account today, and you could use it, which is great. The federated access to ORCID is the safest and most sustainable way to manage access at scale. This cuts both ways. It is the most safe and the most sustainable way for ORCID, as well as your institution, to configure for whether ORCID is your first service or it's your 33rd service. Configuring the research and scholarship entity category support is going to unlock a number of other services for you. And that's what we're talking about, implementing RNS. It just opens up the door. So while early days here in Canada, we're working on having other services. We're working with Compute Canada and their early stage of development on what services they have that they want to have the research and scholarship tag applied to it, as well as with Research Data Canada and Mark Leggett on how to have services there in that portfolio be an RNS capable as well. So just in Canada, things will just start working once your identity providers support the RNS. In addition to that, we're also working with the CIOs through Cuccio on getting the message out like you are hearing today on this call. So we're just on the home stretch here. So our homework, or some of the, you may have already done this, so you can sit back and relax. But if you haven't joined the Canadian Access Federation, we recommend that you visit the CANARIE website and apply to join CAF. We have a thing called a trust assertion document, and what that is a document that, if I were to sum up in the fewest words, it's say what you do and do what you say. This is about what your privacy policy is, who is your technical contact, what kind of systems do you have behind the scenes. It's a document that is just enough to describe your behavior, so other of your participants in the Canadian Access Federation, if they want to see how you do your operations, it's enough there. Those documents are public on the CANARIE website, and you can take a look at any of the other participants. Part of the trust in the Canadian Access Federation is signing the participation agreement. This is the legally binding document that usually the central IT department signs. And this is what we use to make sure that the right organization is who they say they are, and provides the right context. We recognize that there may be people on the call today say, well, I'm a project at the institution. Do I do this? Or does the central IT, does my VP research do this? So if you're a project, we recommend that you talk to your sponsor or your department head and say, if we're going to do federated sign-on, we want to do it in the least effort way, and we want to streamline this. There have been occasions where projects do independently join the Canadian Access Federation, but we also strive to find the right home for those first to make it efficient and effective for you. Usually what happens on campus is the home institution acquires the funding and the project works at the institution. So talk with your central IT department. We have this one line that says implement the Federated Identity Management Service. So that's a whole other topic. But for us today, if you don't have an identity provider that's serving up that single sign-on page, or you are using different technology than some of the open source stuff, such as ADFS, then definitely contact us at tickets@canarie.ca. Be glad to have a conversation. And we do have this application process. So we recommend, as if you're starting out brand new, to do these two together. And the actual enabling of the RNS entity category release is done, in the case of our ADFS toolkit, automatically as using it, and we have configurations online. And once again, easier access to services is really the calling card here. And with that, with a few minutes left, which I think that's good timing here, we definitely would like to open up the floor to questions. In English ou en français aussi? So, just make it.
And
go ahead.
maybe, Chris, if you wouldn't mind, I think if you could help me, if you were to go to Google, I'd like to, I should have thought of this before, but the University of Arizona has a very clear and simple and straightforward single sign-on page to demonstrate to institutions what this could possibly look like. So I think if you were just University of Arizona and then just Orchid, it should come up. Just to give you a little bit of a sense of a very neat and clean single sign-on.
Okay.
Just to give a bit of a sense. I think I'm not sure if we can see this. So yeah, you'd be able to see there that this is kind of what a landing page could look like as a single sign-on for researchers. So you can see that you have that really simple, straightforward, get an ORCID ID, understanding on the left side what is ORCID, why, who you'd be able to contact to talk about ORCID, and then here really simply in the middle you have that create and connect ORCID ID button. And what that does is that if you have a researcher with a pre-existing ORCID ID, that's an opportunity for you to connect to theirs, and they would sometimes have done that through single sign-on, and that asserts the affiliation between you as a researcher and an institution. And it's also an opportunity for them to create an ORCID ID, which will be rapidly ingested into their system with single sign-on. So this is just an example of what it could look like from the researcher's perspective, because I know sometimes it can be a bit hard to visualize what it would look like once you're finished building it. Because after you've done all the steps that Chris outlined, you would then, particularly if you're an Orchid CA member, you would have a conversation with me where you would request production credentials. And as part of that production credentials being issued is that I would go over your integration and what your single sign-on approach to look like. And we would go through and make sure that it resembled something like this, where you really have those two-pronged approaches of understanding that not everyone in your institution will already have an ORCID ID or may not be as familiar with what ORCID is, and really most importantly, what you anticipate doing with it. So that can be sometimes an issue. So you can see in this example on the left-hand side, they outline pretty clearly what they anticipate doing with your ORCID information. So I can send this link to everyone after. This is just the nicest, cleanest version I found so far, and I'm sure soon we'll have Canadian examples.
Yeah. So there are a couple of questions here in the queue. So one of the selling points of ORCID is that it's portable. Using single sign-on, create an account. You're tied to are you tied to an institution, and it is no longer portable? Is there a process through which users can create separate credentials? So that submission. So your ORCID is the users. It's a convenience factor of it being created and linked to your single sign-on account. So if you want to link your ORCID account to a different one, you can do that. So it is portable regardless of how you sign in. It's just easier to sign in with a credential that is the federated sign-on one. So I do want to dispel the notion that if I've created an ORCID through my institution, it's mine, let's say, for instance, at Queen's. No, it's Chris's. And it is portable because it's Chris's, and Chris signs in with his Queen's IDP, or it's, in my case, my affiliation is with CANARIE and my demonstration is with CANARIE, signing in. that was to make it convenient for me and keep signed in that way.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, permissions are always based at the researcher level. So even though an institution technically has requested permission to assert affiliation with you, and on the positive side for institutions, those credentials last 20 years, at any point you can revoke those permissions so that you are no longer attached only to, for example, in Amy's case, Guelph, and then if you researcher were to go on to another institution thereafter, they would be able to revoke the permissions for Guelph to interact with their ORCID record, and then their future employer could then assert affiliations thereafter. So you're never tied to it, unlike certain other identifiers where you are not in control of how your information is being used.
Yeah, that's a good follow-on question, Amy. I understand permissions. A researcher without SSO, how would I log in if I only had done through the FIM previously? I don't have a good answer to that one off the cuff, because when I've created my ORCID, I created mine initially through orchid.org, and then I linked it. So there is a way to do account claim within ORCID. I would check in with the ORCID FAQ side of things there, but I'll be more prepared next time. Sorry about that, Amy. Good question, though. I like it. ORCID's created through the institutional login tied to that organization, or can the ORCID be transferred to another institutional login? That was from Kevin. So I think we kind of answered that one already. So you can sign in and then be asked to sign in again locally at the ORCID one to do what we call an account claim kind of story. And that ORCID supports that, and that's not your institutional need or behavior. So it is portable, and I just want to make sure I answered it. Yeah, it's linked to the institutional login. It's not, the word I would use is it's not beholden to the institutional login, i.e. if I had left CANARIE, would I be required to use CANARIE to sign into my ORCID? No, I could still reassociate it with other things. Great. We have another one. Is ORCID authentication supported by OwnCloud? So I don't know. I know I'm familiar with OwnCloud and their storage. So I know they do SAML, so Federated Sign-On. I don't know if they do that kind of authorization. So ORCID has the notion of Federated Identity Management Authentication, aka user ID password sign-on, and what we just talked about today. But there's this other authorization thing, much like you see with Google or Facebook. I authorize Facebook to share my information. People interpret authorization as authentication. I know OwnCloud does a variety of things. I don't know if they've implemented ORCID. Sorry about it. You'd have to check the OwnCloud site. Another one from Jason. So we have, as an organization, I offer a sign-on service and want ORCID users to see my institutional login list on ORCID. Do I join CAF or integrate with ORCID? In order to see that login, you join the Canadian Access Federation. Now, I don't know, Jason, which organization you are with. You may already be part of the Canadian Access Federation, maybe with another service, such as Eduroam, which is something else we operate. If so, that means you've already done the membership side of things, and now it's about just implementation side. So definitely drop us a line at tickets@canarie.ca or CAF@canarie.ca. We have that on the screen right now. So I think, yeah, if to the air quotes integrate with ORCID part, I'm reading integrate with as the authorization side, which I lean towards, which is why you would be part of the ORCID consortium, because you want API access to be able to integrate, to exchange and update records of researchers on their behalf. So deeper conversation there. Just checking the time, we have only 5 minutes left. So next one. So Bin, just want to ask, after verifying whether our institution IDP is in EduGain, is there a formal way to test ORCID connection, especially with our test IDP? That's a good question. So the EduGain bridge is production and production only. Ben, I think you and I have actually been back having other testing back channel conversations on some of the stuff. That's a great question. And if you're trying to do the institutional IDP sign-on, your IDP has to be an EduGain. And I believe your domain, I think your institution just added, we just added your IDP to production. So I think you should be able to test it now. But the notion of bridging, yeah, just this week. Yeah, so there are ways to do it. We can take offline for testing a pre-production instance, but not the test one unless, you know, we get very technical on this. So there are highly technical ways, so we can check. The slides will be made available. Thanks, Tristan. So we had another one from Jason here. So I joined CAF, then I'll see my org in the ORCID ID list. So the short answer is yes. The longer answer is you join the Canadian Access Federation and you work with us on activating your identity provider in Canadian Access Federation. And so yes, it's just join, but there is some work on you and your IT organization to stand up the right interface.
Yeah, just to highlight that, in the absence of an ORCID integration, those, even if you do have your organization's icon appearing, you will not immediately just use, won't be able to access an ORCID ID immediately in the absence of any type of ORCID integration. So many of these institutions, we can now see their logos, but if they haven't built an ORCID integration, that will not right away set up the single sign-on.
So that integration, so there's two layers to that. And, and I think Gloria, on our side here at the Canadian Access Federation, it's all about our attributes being released. And that's the key integration point, is once your service is up, our attributes being released. And if you see your record green in EduGain, that's a fantastic start. And to Ben's question a few moments ago about how do I test things, you can sign in with your production IDP, and making sure you do the attribute release is critical to that. There is the ORCID CA consortium integration activity, which is about API access, and there's a rich conversation about those with research projects or those kinds of things on the go, which will sort of complement each other. We have another one here, Sean. If we configure our IDP to release the required attributes to service providers marked with RNS attributes, is that sufficient, or does the IDP also need to be marked as an RNS member? You'll have water flowing through the pipes doing the first part. However, we know that some services in the field are preferring to list RNS tagged identity providers first. So there's absolutely a value of being tagged to be, let's call it full round trip, both sides of the coin tagged, saying do what you say and tell people what you do. So that's the first part. If you've already got the attribute release in place with the RNS tag, that's fantastic. You're doing a great job. That will get your researchers in. However, from a sustaining standpoint, we really strongly encourage sites to also just communicate with us and just fill out the attestation form for the RNS tagging. That's important as well, because what's going to happen, and in some cases, kind of repetitive here, what's happening is there's going to be preferential treatment on services to be in a certain list. And we want you to be in that list if you're doing the right thing. We want the acknowledgement that you're doing the right thing here. Do you have specific documentation on configuring ADFS4 for ORCID CANARIE participation? Yes, we do. It's our ADFS toolkit. And I don't see the link in here, but I believe www.canarie.ca/ADFS toolkit, all lowercase, will get you to that. And because ADFS toolkit paired with ADFS v4 supports RNS out of the box, and there are instructions to load both the domestic and the interfederation aggregate, you'll be ready to go. But we encourage you, Tim, to make sure your identity provider is in the Access Federation, because you need to be there. Sorry, Tim, I recognize the name, I think. Carlton, right? So, yeah. So, absolutely, just come and just give us a call and we can talk in more detail. We're in town, so we'd be glad to visit. So Amy, is there a list of services in the RNS category other than ORCID? Yes, there is. And just as it's not the most elegant service catalog. So as you can see, I'm visiting the technicaledugain.org, and I'm choosing the entities database. And then I can choose service providers, and then I choose research and scholarship entity category. So you can see here the question earlier about saying, should I be tagged? This is about saying, hey, I support it. So when I choose show, these are the 189 services across 19 federations worldwide are RNS. So I'm not going to go through each and every one of them, but this is currently the most visible service catalog. And I'm just doing a time check, and I see we're about 1 minute over. So is there a way to redirect to the institutional account tab by default? Well, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that one. My hypothesis is yes, there is, but we would have to talk directly with ORCID to just get it would probably be a particular way to construct the URL, but I think so. But with that, I think we've had some really good questions. I want to say thank you to everyone on the call. I appreciate it. We're seeing some people drop off. And so, again, thank you for your time. And we hope to have a chat again. Thanks.